Have you ever wanted to be the president? Have you seen this country going down a dark path and thought that you could do better? Have you ever wanted the power to permanently change the lives of every single person on the planet? Well, that's too bad, because if you're watching this video, you've already set yourself down a life path where that will never happen. But presidents are important. They define eras, set precedents, and do every bad thing the government has ever done. It's just all blamed on one guy, which is why presidential elections are so important. And few have been as important or as close as the 2000 election of Bush versus Gore. An election separated by only one vote that would turn out to decide one of the most important presidencies ever. But before we start, since I'm gonna do a series on these from like here to here, so I don't know, elections are just about as political as it gets. So it's important to remember, guys, when I talk about politics, I believe in whatever ideology you believe in, which is the objectively right one, of course. But first, we have to start at the start of the end of the Clinton administration. It's 1999 in America, and it's pretty awesome. Music was great, the economy was doing well, we weren't in any wars, not directly at least, and we weren't under the constant threat of being engulfed in a thermonuclear blast anymore. Things were pretty good for President Clinton, but his second term was at an end. It had been fun, maybe a little too fun, but now it was time to leave the White House. But there was one man who wasn't ready for the party of the 90s to be over just yet. Clinton's Vice President Al Gore. The son of a senator, he attended Harvard University with his good friend Tommy Lee Jones, yes, that one, before going to Vietnam. Even though he opposed the war and could have easily gotten out of it, he felt it was his duty to go. And also, his father was vocally anti-war, so he hoped that going would get his pops re-elected, which didn't work, so he kinda went for nothing. Oopsie. After coming home, he would get into politics himself, being elected to the House in the 70s and the Senate in the 80s. While there, he was known for his support of computer legislation that would lead to the internet as we know it today, so you can blame him for all of this. Clinton liked the cut of his jib and asked him to be his vice president in '92 to run against the incumbent president George H.W. Bush, who they defeated. And 8 years in the White House later, Gore was done playing second fiddle. He wanted to be president himself and ran for the Democrat nomination. Lucky for him, he was the clear choice and won the nomination with little competition. He was a pretty popular guy, so it seemed like Al would slide into the White House as easy as Clinton into some panties. If it weren't for an enemy he had helped create almost a decade ago. George W. Bush. George W., as he liked to be called, was the first son of future President George H.W. Bush. Bush also went to an Ivy League school, joined the Texas Air National Guard, and got into some business ventures. After messing around with oil for a while, because that's just what you do in Texas, he bought a large stake in the Texas Rangers, becoming a well-known and beloved part owner. Bush loved baseball so much, in fact, that he was thinking about becoming commissioner of the MLB. But that all changed when his father lost the presidency to Clinton and Gore. A fire was lit in the younger Bush, and he swore vengeance on the men who had shamed his father. Well, not really, but he decided to get into politics, becoming the governor of Texas only 2 years later. He was extremely popular as governor, so when he decided to run for president, he managed to win the Republican nomination. And he was determined to win his dad's old office back. The stage was set. Bush versus Gore, and the race was on. Gore had the advantage of being the establishment, the name that everybody knew. Him and Clinton had created a good economy, brokered peace deals across the world, and guided America through what some consider one of its greatest decades. And yet he couldn't really run on any of that, at least not without running into the Lewinsky scandal. I'm gonna make a whole video on this at some point, but long story short, Bill Clinton had a very public and very funny affair with one of his interns, Monica Lewinsky.
My fellow Americans, I did googity that girl.
Now this would have hurt any president's popularity, but the 90s were particularly sensitive about this type of thing. You know, they were still on the whole swearing is evil, D&D is Satan worship, weed makes you want to pound a dude sort of deal. So Gore basically never called on Clinton to help his campaign. Instead, Gore made his platform on keeping the economy strong, investing in technology and healthcare, and stopping climate change. Bush was a likable guy. He was known for working with both parties, championed compassionate conservatism, and seemed like the type of straight-talking guy you'd want to take you out fishing, like your dad never did. He criticized Clinton and Gore's foreign policy and promised tax cuts and education reform. His campaign portrayed him as a strong leader with traditional values who would bring dignity back to the White House. But Bush's chill, affable vibes were in stark contrast to his, let's say, aggressive style of running his campaigns. In his first campaign for governor, a rumor circulated that may or may not have been started by his campaign that the incumbent was secretly a lesbian, which was a big no-no in 90s Texas. During the primaries when Bush was losing, a vicious smear campaign was run against his opponent John McCain from an anonymous source. Gee, sure wonder who that was. Now, it wasn't like your wife's a druggie, your daughter's a bastard type smear campaign. Except it was exactly that. McCain had been captured and tortured in Vietnam, so rumors spread that he betrayed his country and that he was no longer mentally fit. Rumors spread that his wife was a drug addict, that he was gay, and that their adopted Bangladeshi daughter was actually McCain's illegitimate half-black child.
I'm calling on my good friend George Bush to stop this now.
And while the presidential campaign wouldn't be that harsh, cause wow, it was still no pillow fight. Bush claimed that Gore was untrustworthy and attacked him on his ties to Russia and his awkward demeanor. Gore once offhandedly claimed that he had created the internet, something he was relentlessly made fun of for decades. God, old memes suck. But some of the criticism wasn't unfounded. Gore was prone to exaggerations and would talk very robotically, something that became an issue during the debates. At the first debate, Gore audibly sighed at Bush and cut him off multiple times. Or like this time where Bush brings up a family and Gore just starts laughing at him.
Let me give you one example. The Strunk family in Allentown, Pennsylvania. I campaigned with him the other day.
Viewers were put off by his demeanor, finding it rude and rehearsed.
You are hearing me talk.
While Bush was as smooth as ever, giving him the lead in the race. It was so bad that reportedly Gore's team made him watch the SNL parody of himself so he would know how to not act. And while later debates seemed better, he still had his awkward moments, like this one time where he just walks up to Bush mid-sentence and says nothing.
But can you get things done? And I believe I can.
Like, why did he do that? But Bush had his fair share of missteps as well. He was often criticized for not knowing much about foreign policy and was known to misspeak a lot. So often that Bush-isms would become a staple of his speeches and the second funniest J. Cole sample. And while they didn't know it at the time, this is probably the most ominous thing a candidate has ever said.
Hope to be able to convince people I could handle the Iraqi situation better.
It was clear to some that Gore had the experience Bush lacked. Throughout the campaign, the lead in the polls was as contested as the last needle in the heroin stack. The lead would change 9 times during the campaign. With both candidates considered fairly moderate, voters could be swung to either side.
Watch me break it down! Oh yeah!
As election week arrived, Bush sat with a 4-point lead in the polls, and it seemed like he just might pull this off. But just 5 days before the election, a news reporter found a drunk driving citation Bush had gotten years ago. Like I said, the country was really sensitive about this sort of thing. And with his message of bringing dignity back to the White House basically out the window, he lost the lead in the polls and feared he had lost the presidency. On election day, the race was neck and neck. Bush easily won most of the South and rural Midwest, while Gore won the Pacific Coast and most of the Northeast. Due to Bush's controversy, some estimated that nearly 3 million voters either changed their vote or stayed home. As election day came to a close and states reported their winners, the votes were essentially tied. It all came down to one last state. Florida. Whoever won here would win the presidency. Now, before we keep going, we need to talk about the American electoral system. Yes, I know. When electing the president, the US uses the Electoral College, an important system vital to our democracy if your side wins, and a stupid, outdated democracy destroyer if your side loses. Basically, each state gets a certain amount of electors who choose the president based on who got the most votes in their state. Think of it like a point system. Each state is worth a certain number of points, and if you get the most votes in a state, you get all of that state's points. So whoever gets the most individual votes doesn't actually matter, it's how many state points you get. Now back to election night. As Florida counted its votes, Gore had a big lead, and it seemed like he would win the state. Major news outlets called Florida for Gore, but they were a bit premature. It happens to the best of us. Because the polls weren't even closed yet, and the votes started swinging towards Bush. News stations took it back and said said that Bush had actually won.
George Bush, governor of Texas, will become the 43rd president of the United States.
When he heard the news, Al Gore called Bush to concede the race and congratulate him. But the votes were still coming in, and news outlets then declared that the state was too close to call.
That would be something if the networks managed to blow it twice in one night.
Speak for yourself.
So Gore called Bush again and took back his concession.
But this race is simply too close to call. Our campaign continues.
Unfortunately for Bush, he had forgotten to invoke the ancient American legal code of no takesies backsies, so both would have to wait for the final count. The final tally had Bush winning, but it was so close that Florida law required a recount. It soon became clear that Americans would not know the new president on election night. This is where the fun begins. Alright, stick with me here. After the machine recount, Bush was only up by 317 votes, but Gore requested the votes be recounted by hand in a few close counties, which they had to do. Problem is, counting hundreds of thousands of votes by hand takes a long time, so counties had trouble meeting deadlines. Not to mention, when they started, a major issue popped up: the votes themselves. The ballots in some places were extremely confusing, because Florida can't just have regular ass ballots. Oh no, we gotta be all special about it. Such as this ballot from Palm Beach, where you not only vote in the middle of the paper for some reason, but candidate Pat Buchanan was confusingly listed second instead of Gore, resulting in over 2,000 Gore voters accidentally voting Buchanan, which really mattered in a race this close. In other areas, you had to punch a hole next to the name of the candidate you wanted to vote for with a little stylus. These were called chads, don't ask me why. The problem was, sometimes the chads didn't go all the way through, so how do you count them? If it was still hanging on by a corner, does that count as a vote? What if it was hanging by 2 corners, or 3? What if it just had an indent on it? Does that count? What if they punched the name into the paper like that guy from Polar Express? Does that count? Nobody could agree. As the weeks dragged on, lawsuits were filed, votes were counted, and protests were held. Gore supporters insisted on recounts, while Bush stands displayed signs reading "Sore Loser Man," a play on Al Gore and his running mate Lieberman, which is honestly pretty funny. Like, what are the odds their names sound like that? They viewed the recounts as Democrats trying to steal the election. In Miami, hundreds of Republican staffers and other protesters broke into the building where they were counting votes, making a ruckus and demanding that it be shut down, which it eventually was. History does not repeat itself, okay? You're just crazy. Gore had a few other issues in the state as well. Katherine Harris was the Secretary of State in Florida, and she was in charge of certifying the votes. Yet, funny enough, she was the co-chair of Bush's campaign in Florida, which, you know, seems like a major conflict of interest. Not to mention that Jeb Bush, George's brother, was the governor of Florida at the time. So Gore really had to fight to get those recounts. On November 26th, weeks after the election, Katherine Harris announced that Bush had the lead in the new certified vote and that the time for recounts was up. Gore's legal team leapt into action, saying that they couldn't certify the votes until the recounts were done, and the Florida Supreme Court agreed. On December 8th, they extended the deadline and ordered a new recount to begin immediately. So then Bush sued, and this was the final straw for the Supreme Court. Now, lawsuits had been flying every which way basically this whole time, and the Supreme Court really did not want to get involved in it, but eventually they had no choice. They took the infamous case of Bush v. Gore, a case that would decide who the president of the new millennium would be. So Bush v. Gore was really 2 cases. 1, are the recounts being done fairly? Each area was counting the hanging chads differently, so was that okay? And 2, could another recount be held in time to certify the votes? It had been more than a month since Election Day, with the whole world's eyes now on the Supreme Court, and on December 12th, they made their decision. As for the first case, the court ruled 7-2 that no, counting the hanging chads differently was not fair, so the recounts had to stop. But as for the second case, could the state come up with a fair recount method in time to certify the votes? In a 5-4 decision, the court ruled they could not. They were out of time, and the election was over. The final tally had Bush ahead by only 537 votes. Despite winning the popular vote by well over 500,000, Gore called to concede.
I spoke with George W. Bush and congratulated him on becoming the 43rd president, and I promised him
that I wouldn't call him back this time.
And George W. Bush would become the 43rd president of the United States. There would be protests at his inauguration, and many believe that Gore had only really lost by 1 vote, 5-4 in the Supreme Court. It's hard to express just how important this election would end up being. Obviously, 2001 turned out to be one of the most important years in American history. So what would have happened if we had a far less charismatic president to unite the country afterwards? And on the other hand, what if we had a president who earlier on cared far more about climate change and probably wouldn't have invaded Iraq? We can talk about the if, ands, or buts all day, but at the end of the day, that's not what matters. Even if the recounts kept happening, who's to say that Bush wouldn't have still won? It's the mark this election left on the systems that run America that had the greatest impact. How the US runs its elections was put under scrutiny that lasts to this day, with issues like absentee ballots, voter ID, and how old our electoral system is being taken far more seriously. And arguably, most importantly, the courts were called into question. The 5-4 vote was cast on ideological lines, with the 5 justices considered conservative siding with Bush and the 4 considered liberal siding with Gore. With its biases on full display, the reputation of the court was smeared in the eyes of many Americans. And nobody knew that better than Justice John Paul Stevens, who in his dissenting opinion wrote, "Although we may never know with complete certainty the identity of the winner of this year's presidential election, the identity of the loser is perfectly clear. It is the nation's confidence in the judge as an impartial guardian of the rule of law. But at least we can all take solace in knowing that it's far behind us, and an election like this will never happen again." Right?